What's going on, everybody? Top 10 Pokemon back, folks. It's your favorite time of the week, the Pokemon card auctions of the week recap. In today's video, we'll be discussing several high-end sales, tons of WotC graded cards, and tons of booster boxes that came by, both vintage and modern. And we also saw the sale of a six-figure first edition Shining Magikarp, an English first edition Shining Magikarp, went for over $100,000. Is this possible? Please stay tuned to the very end. You're going to love today's recap. And after you watch this recap I assembled for you, I'd appreciate it if you went and checked out the 100% Pokemon auction block happening this Sunday, February 8th on fanaticscollect.com. This week we have another fantastic lineup of graded cards featuring several PSA and CGC graded cards as well as some graded video games. Cards like this first edition base set Blastoise and the first edition Flareon from Jungle are up for grabs, as well as some beautiful CGC graded gems also. So after this recap, please go check out these cards on Fanatics. I will put a link to the auction block in the description of this video. And folks, as always, thank you so much for your support. Let's start this recap off with the usual, some modern card sales. Here we have a lot of 20 PSA 10 Japanese McDonald's Burger Chew cards that sold for a total of $1,285. And then we also saw a black label copy of this card come by, in which it sold for $2,225 this week. A couple of sales from the Sun and Moon era. From Unified Minds, we saw this Misty's Favor full art card in PSA 10 that sold for $817. We also saw this BGS 10 black label full art Alolan Ninetales GX from Hidden Fates that sold for $2,100. And then we saw this Cosmos Dragonite Holo from the Sun and Moon era that sold as a PSA 10 for $2,026. Speaking of Dragonite, a couple of cards from the XY era. Here is a Reverse Holo Dragonite from Roaring Skies that sold for $1,282 as a PSA 10. From Breakthrough, we saw this Mega Mewtwo EX sell for $1,126. Here's a Full Art Mewtwo EX, also from Breakthrough, sold for $930. Here is a XY promo Magikarp Holo that sold for $1,250 this week. Here is the Mega Gengar EX Black Star promo. Awesome looking card that sold this week for $5,200. And then we saw two of these Full Art Blastoise EX promo cards in PSA 10. This one here sold for $6,200. The other one sold for $7,300. And then we saw this Mega Rayquaza EX from Roaring Skies that sold as a PSA 10 this week for $13,600. And then one card from the Black and White era, it was this Full Art Skyla from Boundaries Crossed that sold for $3,700. And then on to the vintage sales on eBay. Let's start off with some base set bangers. Here is the first edition Charmander from base set in PSA 10, sold for $2,475. While the Squirtle did significantly better, selling for $3,525. And historically speaking, the Squirtle, out of the three starters from the set, always did the worst in terms of its value. This week, it might have even beaten the Bulbasaur in value. I'm not sure because I didn't see a Bulbasaur come by, but old Bulbasaur usually sells for around $3,000, so Squirtle might be the new king of the Gen 1 starters. And then from Ryan's Card House, he auctioned off this PSA 9 first edition base set Charizard with the silver NBA diamond stamp on there. This card sold for $72,700 this week. The PSA 9 copy of this card has skyrocketed in recent times. And then we saw several beauties from Jungle Set. Here's the first edition Scyther that sold for $4,383. The first edition Flareon sold as a PSA 10 for $5,616. The first edition Pidgeot sold for $5,979. And then we saw a couple of awesome cards from Fossil come by. Here is the Aerodactyl that sold for $3,250. And then we saw all three of the legendary birds from Fossil come by. Here's the Zapdos that sold for $3,088. The Moltres sold for $5,250. And then the Articuno blew them both out of the water, selling this week for $11,300. Articuno, of course, being the lowest pop bird in this set. Couple of cards from the Team Rocket set. Here is an unlimited Dark Dragonite Holo sold for $4,650, while the first edition Dark Charizard sold in PSA 10 for $14,400. On to the Neo series, we saw this Dark Porygon 2 Unlimited Holo sell for $970 as a PSA 10. I've always thought that the PSA 10 Unlimited Holos from WotC kind of get a bad rap when it comes to their value. I think they're worth a lot more than they go for, considering most of them are lower pop than their first edition counterparts. Here is a CGC10 Pristine first edition for Alligator number 4 that sold for $2,950. Here is a PSA 9 Reverse Holo Charizard from Legendary Collection that sold for $8,350 this week. And then on to the old school EX era, we have this Ninetales EX from Hidden Legends that sold for $3,050. And folks, I have an embarrassing confession to make. It was just today I realized that the background of this card on the sides there are what looks to be Ninetales' eyes. Didn't realize this until today. Now, in my defense, I've never actually held this card in front of me in person, but I was really looking at it and I thought, this card is pretty awesome the way that's designed. I don't know. Here we have a PSA 10 Team Aqua's Kyogre Holo that sold for $2,177. Here is a Regice EX from Emerald that sold for $2,771. And then a couple of awesome cards from EX Delta Species. Here is a Reverse Holo Drowsy. Awesome looking card. Sold as a PSA 10 for $690. While the Reverse Holo Ditto, the Squirtle Ditto card, sold for $4,300. And then numerous cards came by from Unseen Forces. Here's the Reverse Holo Totodile that sold for $2,275. Here's a Flareon Holo that sold for $2,475. And here's the Reverse Holo Feraligatr, also from Unseen Forces, that sold for $2,850. And then also from Unseen Forces was this Gold Star Raikou, sold as a PSA 10 for $4,900 this week. From EX Legend Maker, we saw this Holo Whale Lord sell for $3,600. Here's the Reverse Holo Pichu from EX Power Keepers, sold for $3,850. And then we saw a 1 Level X card. It was the Palkia Level X from Platinum that sold for $5,100. And then here we have an adorable Flareon from the Pop Series 3 in PSA 10 that sold for $3,350. And then we saw this PSA 10 Kids WB Trico card. This is a Poke Creator card that sold for $21,100. And then we saw one of the most expensive Snorlaxes in this hobby. It is the Staff pre-release Snorlax Holo from Call of Legends, sold as a PSA 10 for $11,211. And then I wanted to mention this card. I haven't seen it before. It is an Incorrect Rarity Magikarp from Fire Red Leaf Green that sold as a PSA 10 for $526. And what's incorrect about it is I believe this card has the diamond at the bottom of it, meaning that it's an uncommon card, when in reality, I think this card is supposed to be a common card. So it's got a diamond at the bottom instead of a circle. Nothing too major, but it was pretty noteworthy, I thought. And then on to a couple of non-PSA 10 Charizards that came by on alt auctions this week. Here is a BGS 9.5 First Edition Shining Charizard that sold for $10,273. Here's a BGS 8.5 No Rarity Symbol Japanese base set Zard that sold for $13,327. And then we saw a PSA 8 First Edition base set Charizard that sold for $30,302. And then on to the Fanatics weekly auction block, a couple of Black Label cards. Here's a Black Label Mewtwo GX from Hidden Fates that sold for $3,480. Here is a Black Label Umbreon Gold Star from Celebrations that sold for $4,200. And then we saw another Moltres from Fossil come by. This one here sold for $4,440. Another First Edition Scyther came by and it sold for $4,680. Another Pidgeot came by. This one sold for $7,200. Along with the Flareon that also sold for $7,200. And then we saw a Clefable Holo from Jungle in First Edition sell for $7,500. From Fossil, we saw this first edition Lapras that sold for $9,300. And then here's the first edition Wigglytuff from Jungle, very low pop card that sold for $9,600. Up next was this PSA 9, a Crystal Lugia from Aquapolis that sold for $9,600 as well. Here's a PSA 9 Masaki Gengar promo that sold for $10,200. And then the first edition Kangaskhan from Jungle, another very low pop card, sold for $10,800 this week. Up next was this first edition Blaine's Charizard from Gym Challenge, sold as a PSA 10 for $13,800. Here is a black label Japanese Mewtwo GX that sold this week for $16,800. And then one of the most expensive cards from Jungle, second only maybe to Snorlax, was this first edition Vaporeon that sold for $20,400. And then we saw a PSA 9 Japanese Tropical Mega Battle Lucky Stadium promo card that sold for $24,000 even. And then lastly on Fanatics, we saw this little number. It is a PSA 10 Double Hollow Error Shining Magikarp in first edition that sold for $132,000. And I mean, it is a Pop 2 card, folks. And it's a Shining Magikarp, so it's already an S tier card, plus you have an extremely low population on it. Do you think it actually sold for this amount? You think it's worth $132,000? Let me know. And then we're going to finish off this recap with tons of sealed product. Here is a sealed case of Paldea Evolve booster boxes, sold for $2,702. Here is a case of Destined Rivals boxes that sold for $3,750. And then again for $3,800. There just ain't no stopping Destined Rivals. Here's an XY Primal Clash booster box that sold for $2,900, while this black and white base set booster box sold for $7,500. And then on to the Heritage auction block, we have this unlimited base set booster box that sold this week for $31,250, an unlimited Jungle booster box that sold for $14,375, while the first edition box sold for $32,500. Here's a first edition Fossil booster box that sold for $35,000, an unlimited Team Rocket booster box that sold for $15,625, while the first edition box sold for $35,000. Here is an unlimited Gym Heroes booster box that sold for an even $15,000, while the first edition Gym Challenge booster box sold for $31,250. And then we saw an unlimited Neo Genesis box that sold for $30,007. And the final auction in this week's recap was on eBay, and it was this first edition Neo Revelation booster box that sold for a whopping $80,300 this week. Folks, what do you think of this recap? So many cards, so many boxes, so much money flowing through this hobby. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. I look forward to hearing from you. That's all I got for you today, and I'll catch you all in my next one.